house is already sold. Sarah, you and the old lady have exactly 2 hours to get your trash out of my property." Mark sneered, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He had drained our joint accounts and taken the home we shared while my aunt was fighting for her life in the intensive care unit. 3 years later, he bumped into me at a luxury gala celebrating his new $40 million real estate project. He looked down at me and whispered, "Do you remember me?" He had absolutely no idea his entire empire was built on a tiny piece of land I secretly owned. Where are you listening from today, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. 10 minutes before Mark saw me, I was standing in the shadows near the service entrance of the Grand Drake Ballroom. Mark stood on the brilliantly lit stage in a custom-tailored tuxedo. Vanessa stood beside him in a designer silk dress. They were unveiling the crown jewel of Chicago real estate to a room full of hungry investors. It was a $40 million mixed-use commercial development. The crowd was applauding. The expensive champagne was flowing freely. I watched the massive digital screen behind them. It displayed a flawless, high-resolution rendering of the future lobbies, the luxury condominiums, and the sprawling rooftop gardens. Then, the digital camera panned to the proposed boutique lounge area on the ground floor. My eyes locked onto the screen. There it was, a very specific dark green velvet reading chair, Aunt Estelle's chair. Vanessa had taken it from our old house and repurposed it as a vintage aesthetic element for their new corporate playground. My chest tightened for a fraction of a second, but my breathing remained perfectly even. They had built an illusion of grandeur. They had stolen my past to decorate their future. But illusions cost money. I had spent the last 3 years learning how to follow the money. I knew exactly how highly leveraged Mark was to secure this land. I stood there, holding a digital tablet, feeling the crisp, heavy fabric of my own tailored suit. I wasn't the terrified, weeping woman shivering in the snow anymore. I was simply a quiet spectator at a magic show, waiting for the trapdoor to fail. Mark laughed at a joke a wealthy investor made. Vanessa kissed his cheek for the cameras. They looked untouchable. They looked like royalty. I just looked back at the architectural rendering on the screen. The grand facade, the delicate glass structures. It was all built on a very fragile foundation. A foundation they did not truly control. The crowd cheered louder as the presentation concluded. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. I didn't feel the urge to run up to the stage and expose them. Anger is a loud, messy emotion that clouds judgment. I had traded anger for precision a long time ago. Mark built his career on appearances and verbal manipulation. He believed that if a lie looked expensive enough, people would buy it. I operated in a completely different world now. I operated in the world of verifiable assets, binding contracts, and undeniable leverage. Watching him soak in the applause, I felt a profound sense of clinical detachment. He was a man celebrating on the deck of a sinking ship. He had spent months bribing city officials, consolidating lots, and securing mezzanine financing at exorbitant interest rates. He thought he was a mastermind. He thought he had outsmarted everyone, especially me. I adjusted my earpiece as the gala transitioned into the networking phase. Let him enjoy the applause tonight. The applause was temporary. The paperwork was permanent. The countdown had begun. I wasn't at the Drake Hotel to crash a high society party. I didn't forge an invitation, and I certainly didn't sneak past the security detail. I was there because they had paid my company a substantial amount of money to be there. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Logistics. My firm handled the secure transport of every massive LED screen, every structural model, and every piece of heavy audio equipment currently operating in that ballroom. My earpiece buzzed with a steady stream of updates from my floor managers. Loading bay 4 is clear. Security perimeter is locked. I replied with a simple, quiet affirmation. 3 years ago. I didn't know how to route a single commercial freight truck. Now, I orchestrated complex supply chains across the entire Midwest. Mark always thought a woman like me could only ever be a dependent. He believed that taking my joint bank accounts meant taking my capacity to think. He was fatally wrong. The ballroom smelled of expensive orchids and roasted prime rib. I vividly remembered the smell of the studio apartment Mark had banished me to. It smelled of industrial bleach and damp walls. Tonight, I stood in the control perimeter, overseeing an operation that ran like a luxury timepiece. I wasn't seeking a dramatic confrontation. I was seeking a professional observation. I wanted to witness the exact moment the $40 million house of cards was presented to the financial world. A catering manager rushed past me, looking frantic about a delayed shipment of wine. I directed him to the secondary service elevator without breaking my gaze from the main stage. I was entirely invisible to the billionaires mingling in the room. I was just part of the machinery making their elegant night happen. But I held all the practical leverage. I checked the data on my tablet. Every truck was accounted for. Every invoice was signed and legally binding. I operated in reality. I dealt in facts, in hard data, and in physical assets. Mark operated in spin and borrowed capital. The contrast between us was almost poetic. I tapped my earpiece to silence a secondary channel. I had built a fortress of competence while he built a monument to his own ego. Everything was perfectly aligned. The presentation reached its final, most critical phase. Mark pointed a sleek laser pointer at the sprawling digital map of the proposed commercial complex. He talked smoothly about seamless integration with the city grid. He emphasized the modern urban flow and the strategic layout. The graphic slowly zoomed in on the rear elevation of the development. It highlighted a narrow, unassuming strip of land connecting the commercial loading bays to the main public street. Mandatory emergency and delivery access, Mark announced to the room, his voice echoing through the speakers my company had installed. Fully integrated and legally secured for operational efficiency. My eyes locked onto that specific geometric shape on the screen. It was a long rectangle with a very slight, distinct curve at the northern tip. My pulse slowed down to a steady, heavy rhythm. I knew that exact shape. I didn't know it from reviewing public city planning records. I knew it from a faded, yellowed piece of parchment kept inside an old, dented tin tea box. Aunt Estelle's tin box. That strip of land wasn't just a generic city-owned access road. It was a private commercial alleyway. And it didn't belong to the municipal government. It certainly didn't belong to Mark's heavily leveraged holding company. It belonged to an irrevocable trust. A highly protected trust where my signature was the absolute only one that mattered. Mark had spent millions of dollars acquiring the surrounding commercial lots. He manoeuvred, he negotiated, and he consolidated every square inch of available dirt, but his legal team had missed the tiny, crucial artery that made the entire physical organism function. Without clear legal title to that specific alley, city fire trucks couldn't access the residential towers to meet code. Commercial delivery trucks couldn't legally supply the retail ground floor. Without that alley, the city zoning board would never, under any circumstances, grant the final operational occupancy permits. $40 million of imported glass and reinforced steel, entirely dependent on a patch of cracked concrete he had forgotten to steal. I stared at his smug, confident face on the high-definition projector. He was aggressively selling a luxury vehicle that didn't have an engine. He had absolutely no idea. The sheer mathematical beauty of his critical error was staggering. He didn't follow the paper trail deep enough. The trap was locked. 8 years ago, I didn't know how to read a commercial zoning map or analyse a trust document. I was working 3 exhausting jobs just to keep the lights on and pay down crushing university student loans. I was perpetually exhausted. I was vulnerable. That was exactly when Mark noticed me. We met at a corporate networking mixer I was hired to cater. He wore a sharp, expensive suit and carried an aura of absolute financial certainty. To a girl drowning in late payment notices, his certainty looked exactly like safety. He didn't romance me with grand, passionate gestures. He romanced me with cold efficiency. He paid off my final loan balance before we even officially moved in together. "We are a team now," he had said, looking me right in the eyes. At the time, I thought it was a beautiful rescue. I didn't realise it was a calculated acquisition. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the velvet trap closed around me. He managed all our joint accounts because he was better with numbers. He aggressively encouraged me to quit my second job because he claimed he wanted me rested and happy. He handled the mortgage paperwork, the property insurance, and the retirement investments. Every single financial decision was framed as a loving favour to me. But every favour was actually a brick in a soundproof wall built to isolate me. If I ever questioned a financial choice, he would sigh a soft, deeply patronising sound. "Sarah, let me handle the heavy lifting. You just focus on making the house a home." He made me feel incredibly lucky. He made me feel entirely dependent. I slowly lost my financial literacy. I lost my voice in the relationship. I became a passive passenger in my own life. I thought we were building a secure future together. He was simply building a diversified portfolio. The psychological manipulation was so gradual. I never felt the temperature rise in the room. I just woke up one day, 8 long years later, realising I couldn't write a basic cheque without his explicit approval. I had surrendered my personal sovereignty for the illusion of domestic peace. It was a calculated, quiet, and systematic destruction of my independence. I never saw it coming. The velvet was heavy. Long before the luxury galas and the corporate betrayal, there was only Aunt Estelle. When my mother passed away, Estelle took me in without a second of hesitation. She wasn't wealthy. She worked as a high school librarian for 40 years and lived a quiet, modest life. But she gave me the only true sense of safety I had ever known. She had a small bedroom on the first floor of the house Mark and I eventually bought. It was her sanctuary, filled with towering bookshelves and a worn, dark green velvet reading chair by the window. Mark always treated Estelle like an inconvenient piece of furniture. He would walk past her in the hallway without offering a greeting. He constantly complained about the cost of her medications, even though she paid for them from her own meagre pension. I spent years constantly running interference, trying to smooth over his passive-aggressive remarks, trying to make the house feel like a family home. I was too busy maintaining the illusion of peace to notice the reality of his resentments. But Estelle noticed. She saw right through his expensive suits and his polished corporate vocabulary. One evening, about a year before everything fell apart, I was sitting on the floor of her room, helping her organise some old photographs. She asked me to close the door. She reached under her bed and pulled out a faded, floral-patterned tin tea box. The metal was slightly dented on one side. She didn't open it. She just placed her frail, warm hands over mine and pushed the box into my lap. "I have lived a very long time. Sarah," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "I know what a man looks like when he loves himself more than he loves his family. Mark is building a life for Mark. You need to make sure you are protected." I tried to argue, tried to defend my husband out of habit, but she just squeezed my hands tighter. "Put this somewhere safe. Do not tell him it exists. When you feel like you have absolutely no way out, open it." I didn't understand the gravity of her words at the time. I just hid the box in the back of my closet to humour her. I had no idea that dented piece of metal held the key to a $40 million trap. I pushed the tin box to the very back of the highest shelf in my closet, behind winter coats I rarely wore. I wanted to forget about it. Acknowledging the box meant acknowledging the cracks in my marriage. It meant admitting that my aunt, who watched us interact every single day, saw a predator instead of a partner. I chose denial. It was easier to wake up, make breakfast, manage the household logistics, and pretend everything was perfectly normal. I convinced myself that Estelle was just being a cautious, overprotective older woman. I continued to let Mark handle our investments. I continued to let him manage the deed to the house. I let the velvet trap tighten its grip around my life, completely unaware that a quiet librarian had already mapped out my only escape route. The box stayed hidden. The Chicago winter hit early that year, bringing brutal winds and a deep, relentless freeze. In late November, Aunt Estelle developed a severe chest infection that rapidly escalated into pneumonia. Her breathing became shallow and ragged. I called the ambulance in a panic one Tuesday morning when she couldn't get out of her green velvet chair. She was rushed to the intensive care unit. Suddenly, my entire world shrank to the size of a sterile hospital waiting room. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor became the only sound that mattered. The medical bills started piling up almost immediately. The out-of-pocket costs for specialised respiratory treatments were staggering. This was the moment I desperately needed my husband. I needed the man who had promised to be my partner. Instead, Mark vanished. He became a phantom in our own home. He suddenly had a relentless schedule of emergency client dinners and critical out-of-state site visits. He would leave the house before I woke up and return long after I had fallen asleep exhausted on the living room sofa. When I did manage to get him on the phone to discuss the hospital invoices, his voice was entirely devoid of warmth. He spoke to me like a middle manager addressing a failing department. "We need to be practical about this, Aunt Sarah," he would say, the sound of ice clinking in a glass audible in the background. "We can't bankrupt our future for a situation that has no viable return on investment." He was talking about a human life. He was talking about the woman who raised me. One evening, he came home briefly to pack a suitcase for another supposed business trip. Was doing laundry. I picked up one of his dress shirts to fold it, and the scent hit me. It wasn't the smell of an airport lounge or a corporate boardroom. It was a heavy, expensive floral perfume. A very distinct, custom-blended fragrance. I recognised it immediately. It belonged to Vanessa, the lead interior designer working on his firm's new commercial projects. I stood in the laundry room holding the shirt. My aunt was breathing through a machine across town, and my husband was smelling of another woman's perfume. I didn't confront him. I carefully folded the shirt and placed it in his suitcase. The coldness inside me was beginning to set in. I realised then that the marriage had been a transaction all along, and the contract was currently under revision. He wasn't just avoiding the hospital. He was actively preparing to cut his losses. Every late night, every whispered phone call he took out on the balcony, every time he casually mentioned that the housing market was shifting, it was all part of a quiet, deliberate exit strategy. I spent my days talking to doctors about oxygen levels and my nights pacing the empty hallways of a house that no longer felt like mine. The isolation was absolute. I was so consumed by the immediate terror of losing my aunt that I completely failed to monitor our financial perimeter. I was watching the wrong door. Mark knew exactly how distracted I was, and he weaponized that distraction with terrifying precision. We were completely alone. The manipulation did not happen in a boardroom. It happened under the flickering fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor at 2 a.m. I had been awake for nearly 48 hours straight. The doctors had just informed me that Estelle needed a specialised, highly expensive surgical procedure by the end of the week, or her lungs would simply give out. I was sitting on a plastic chair, staring at the linoleum floor, completely paralysed by exhaustion and fear. That was when Mark appeared. He didn't look like a cheating husband. He looked deeply concerned. He was carrying a thick manila folder and 2 cups of bad hospital coffee. He sat next to me and put his arm around my shoulders. It was the first time he had touched me in weeks. "I figured it out," he said softly, his voice full of manufactured reassurance. "I spoke to the bank. We can leverage the equity in the house to cover the surgery and all the post-operative care. We just need to restructure the primary loan agreement. It will free up a massive line of credit." He opened the folder. The documents were dense, filled with complex legal jargon and tiny print. I looked at the pages, but the letters just blurred together. My brain simply refused to process the information. "The bank needs this finalised before the morning processing cycle, or the funds won't clear by Friday," he urged, pressing a premium ink pen into my trembling hand. "I know you're tired. Sarah, let me carry this burden. Just sign the authorizations, and I will handle the transfer tomorrow. Estelle is going to be fine." This is the anatomy of a perfect trap. He didn't use threats. He used my desperation as the bait and framed himself as the saviour. He knew I was too terrified of losing my aunt to pause and hire an independent attorney to review the paperwork. I looked at his face. I desperately wanted to believe the man I married was finally stepping up to protect us. I took the pen. I flipped to the tabs marked with yellow sticky notes. I didn't read the clauses about asset transfer. I didn't read the addendums regarding sole ownership. I just wrote my name, over and over again, trading my entire financial reality for a promise that didn't exist. He closed the folder, kissed my forehead, and walked quickly toward the elevators. The ink was black. 3 weeks later, the doctors delivered a miracle. Aunt Estelle was stabilised and officially cleared for discharge. She was frail, requiring a wheelchair and an oxygen tank. But she was alive. I drove us back to the house on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was the colour of bruised iron, and the snow was piling heavily on the sidewalks. I just wanted to get her into her warm room, onto her green velvet chair, and make a pot of tea. I unlocked the front door and pushed her wheelchair into the foyer. The house was freezing. The heat had been turned off. I looked into the living room and stopped breathing. The furniture was gone. The rugs were gone. Stacked neatly by the front door were 5 large cardboard boxes and 2 suitcases. They contained my clothes and Estelle's personal items. Standing in the centre of the empty room was Mark. He was wearing a heavy cashmere overcoat, checking his expensive watch. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The house is already sold." "Sarah," Mark said, not even making eye contact. He spoke with the casual tone of someone cancelling a dinner reservation. "The market was highly favourable. The transaction closed this morning. The new owners take possession tomorrow." I stared at him, my mind desperately trying to connect the pieces. "Sold what about the medical loan? What about our savings?" "There was no loan," he replied, finally looking at me. His eyes were completely dead. "You signed the quitclaim deed. I liquidated the joint accounts. $150,000. Completely clean. I needed the capital for a massive commercial buy-in, and you were becoming a financial liability. My attorney will email you the divorce petition by 5 o'clock. You and the old lady have exactly 2 hours to get your trash off my property." He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He just systematically dismantled my life with corporate efficiency. He looked at Estelle, shivering in her wheelchair, and showed absolutely zero remorse. He buttoned his coat, stepped past us, and walked out the front door, leaving us in the freezing, empty house. I stood there, listening to the engine of his luxury sedan start up and drive away into the snow. I didn't drop to the floor. I didn't start screaming. I turned to my aunt, gripped the handles of her wheelchair, and calculated exactly how much cash I had in my wallet. The cold radiating from the hardwood floors seemed to seep directly into my bones. Estelle reached up and touched my arm, her fingers trembling, but her gaze incredibly steady. She didn't ask questions. She didn't panic. She just looked around the empty space that had been her sanctuary for over a decade, and then looked back at me. We had $64 in cash, a half-empty tank of gas in my aging sedan, and 5 cardboard boxes holding the remnants of our existence. I pulled my heavy wool scarf off and wrapped it securely around her neck. The sheer audacity of his cruelty wasn't something to cry over. It was an education. He had shown me the exact blueprint of how power operated when stripped of empathy. I moved efficiently, loading the boxes into the trunk, securing the oxygen tank in the back seat, and lifting my aunt into the car. I didn't look back at the house as I drove away. It was just a building now. The lock clicked shut. I found an emergency month-to-month rental on the south side of the city. It was a cramped, single-room studio apartment located directly above an active transit line. The rent was $950, which took exactly everything I had managed to scrape together from a high-interest payday loan. The apartment smelled strongly of industrial bleach and fried food from the diner downstairs. Every 15 minutes, the commuter train would roar past, rattling the cheap window frames and vibrating the chipped floorboards beneath our feet. I set up a small medical cot for Estelle in the corner furthest from the drafty window. I slept on a thin foam mat on the floor. Within 48 hours of the eviction, the divorce papers arrived via certified courier. They were ruthless. Because I had signed away my rights under the guise of the medical emergency, I was entitled to absolutely nothing. No alimony, no division of the liquidated savings, no claim to the property. He had legally erased me. A week later, I opened my laptop to check the balance on my maxed-out credit card. I mistakenly opened a social media tab. There it was. A public post from Vanessa's design firm. It featured a beautifully lit photograph of my old living room. She had moved in immediately. The caption read, "Thrilled to begin renovations on this gorgeous property with my amazing partner, Mark, creating our dream space." In the background of the photo, sitting in the corner like a cheap prop, was Estelle's dark green velvet chair. I stared at the glowing screen while the train roared past the window, shaking the walls of the tiny studio. A lesser woman might have broken the laptop. A lesser woman might have driven over there and caused a scene. I simply closed the lid of the computer. The initial shock of the betrayal had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, highly compressed core of absolute clarity. Mark had weaponized paperwork to destroy my family. He had used contracts to strip me of my dignity. He thought I was stupid. He thought I was defeated. I stood up, walked over to the stack of our moving boxes, and pulled out a faded, floral-patterned tin tea box. I set it carefully on the small kitchen counter. It was time to learn his language. I ran my fingers over the dented metal lid of the box. Estelle was sleeping quietly on her cot, the soft hiss of the oxygen concentrator blending with the distant hum of traffic. I didn't open the box yet. I realised that whatever legal protection my aunt had left inside was useless if I didn't have the resources, the intellect, and the strategic patience to wield it properly. Mark was a vice president of a real estate development firm. He had armies of lawyers at his disposal. I was a broke logistics manager living above a train track. If I rushed into battle now, he would crush me legally and financially all over again. I needed capital. I needed an unimpeachable reputation. And more importantly, I needed to become a woman who understood the ruthless mechanics of leverage. I looked at the dark street outside the frosted window. I wasn't going to just survive this winter. I was going to use the cold to forge myself into something unbreakable. I turned away from the window and started drafting a 5-year operational plan on a legal pad. The grief turned cold. Aunt Estelle survived that brutal Chicago winter, but the pneumonia had permanently weakened her heart. 6 months after Mark threw us out of our home, she passed away peacefully in her sleep at the studio apartment. The room was quiet. The commuter train was stopped for routine night maintenance. There were no flashing ambulance lights this time. No frantic hospital corridors, and no manipulative paperwork. There was just a profound, dignified stillness. I arranged a very small, remarkably simple funeral at a local community chapel. Only 4 people attended. I sat in the front row, wearing a plain black dress I had purchased from a discount store. Mark, of course, did not make an appearance. He didn't even send a generic floral arrangement. He had completely erased us from his corporate narrative. The only person outside of the chapel staff who sat with me was Walter. Walter owned the small diner on the ground floor of our apartment building. He was a retired logistics supervisor, a quiet man with perceptive eyes who had occasionally helped me carry Estelle's oxygen tanks up the narrow stairs. After the service concluded, Walter walked me out to the curb. He didn't offer empty platitudes or unsolicited advice. He just handed me a cup of black coffee and stood beside me in the autumn breeze. "You have a very specific kind of quiet about you, Sarah," Walter noted, watching the traffic pass. "Most people who get hit by a freight train spend the rest of their lives complaining about the noise. You just look like you are studying the tracks." I took a sip of the bitter coffee. I looked back at the modest chapel. I didn't feel broken. I felt a tremendous, sweeping sense of absolute focus. I had spent 8 years trying to please a man who viewed human beings as disposable assets. I had spent 6 months watching the woman who raised me slowly fade away in a vibrating room above a train track. I made a silent promise to the cold air. I would never, under any circumstances, allow another human being to hand me a pen and dictate my survival. I thanked Walter for the coffee and walked back to work. I returned to the studio apartment that afternoon. It felt incredibly vast and entirely empty, without the rhythmic hiss of Estelle's oxygen machine. I systematically packed away her few remaining clothes to donate to a local women's shelter. I didn't keep items just for the sake of holding on to grief. Grief is a heavy anchor, and I needed to be exceptionally light for the climb ahead. The only item I did not donate was the faded, floral pattern tin tea box. I placed it on the small kitchen table, wiping a thin layer of dust from its dented lid. I still hadn't opened it. I knew that whatever legal or financial information it contained required a mind that was sharp, educated, and completely detached from emotion. I wasn't there yet. I was still operating on survival instincts. But staring at that box, I felt the first real spark of strategic ambition. Mark had built his entire life on the assumption that I would always remain financially illiterate and emotionally dependent. He relied on my ignorance. It was time to systematically dismantle that reliance. I gathered my work uniform and prepared for my evening shift. The past was dead. Society expects a woman who has lost her home, her savings, and her family to exhibit very specific behaviours. They expect her to cry on social media, to beg her ex-husband for a modest settlement, or to spiral into a visible depression. I chose absolute, terrifying silence. Silence is the most powerful incubator for extreme growth. I took a second job working the night shift at a massive commercial freight hub on the edge of the city. I spent my days dispatching delivery vans for Walter's small transport network, and my nights observing how millions of dollars in physical goods moved across the country. I wasn't just moving boxes, I was studying the central nervous system of global commerce. I wanted to understand how leverage actually worked. Instead of watching television, I spent my meagre breaks reading textbooks on commercial real estate law, supply chain logistics, and contract negotiation. I learned the difference between mezzanine debt and senior secured loans. I learned how zoning variances were acquired and how shell companies masked true ownership. The legal jargon that Mark used to intimidate and confuse me in that hospital corridor slowly translated into basic, readable mechanics. It wasn't magic. It was just a language, and I was becoming fluent. My colleagues at the freight hub thought I was unusually intense. I never joined them for drinks after a shift. Every spare dollar I earned went into a high-yield savings account that I monitored with obsessive precision. I lived on a strict budget calculated down to the final cent. Mark had controlled me by keeping the financial ledger hidden in the dark. I responded by flooding my own ledger with brilliant, unforgiving light. I practiced analysing complex commercial leases until I could spot a predatory liability clause in under 30 seconds. I realised that Mark's entire existence was built on exploiting the financial ignorance of others. He wasn't a genius, he was simply a highly organised predator. I stopped feeling angry at his betrayal. Anger is a remarkably inefficient use of cognitive energy. Instead, I viewed him as a fascinating case study in corporate vulnerability. He was arrogant, heavily leveraged, and deeply dependent on external capital. I studied his operational model until I understood its structural flaws better than he did. I didn't want a fragile apology. I wanted absolute, undeniable leverage. I began to see the city not as a collection of buildings, but as a massive web of contracts and permits. Every luxury high-rise, every trendy restaurant, every commercial parking lot existed only because someone had properly filed the correct paperwork and secured the necessary municipal approvals. Mark operated in the glamorous, highly visible tier of this system, glad-handing investors and pitching architectural dreams. I positioned myself in the invisible, foundational tier. I was mastering the unglamorous mechanics that actually kept the concrete standing. Walter began to notice my growing proficiency. He started letting me draft the vendor agreements for his dispatch business, silently reviewing my work and nodding in approval. He taught me how to negotiate routing contracts without giving up margin. He taught me the brutal art of walking away from a bad deal without showing any emotion. I absorbed the information like dry earth absorbing rain. The terrified woman who had signed away her home in a hospital hallway was completely gone. She had been replaced by an operator. I learned their language. 3 years is an eternity when you spend every single day executing a flawless operational strategy. Under Walter's quiet mentorship, I leveraged my accumulated savings and my immaculate credit score to secure a commercial business loan. I didn't buy a flashy car or upgrade my wardrobe. I bought 3 used, highly reliable commercial freight trucks. I founded Apex Logistics. I didn't compete with the massive international shipping conglomerates. I targeted the highly specialised, high-margin niche of secure commercial event transport. I hauled delicate architectural models, fragile LED staging equipment, and high-value interior fixtures for corporate launches. I built a reputation for absolute ruthless reliability. If Apex Logistics signed a contract, the assets arrived on site exactly at the designated minute, completely undamaged. My client list grew from 3 desperate event planners to 20 top-tier corporate firms in under 18 months. I leased a small, purely functional office space in an industrial park. I hired a brilliant, no-nonsense operations manager and 2 dedicated dispatchers. The revenue numbers climbed steadily, transforming from modest survival margins into substantial corporate profit. I finally moved out of the vibrating studio apartment above the train tracks. I purchased a minimalist, beautifully soundproofed condominium on the 22nd floor of a quiet residential building. It had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, cold hardwood floors, and absolutely zero vintage furniture. I bought it in cash. It belonged entirely to a limited liability company that I completely controlled. No one could ever walk into my living room and tell me I had 2 hours to pack my boxes. I had constructed a fortress. I was entirely self-sufficient. Mark and his glittering, leveraged world felt like a distant, irrelevant television show. I rarely thought about him. When I did, it was with the detached curiosity of an auditor reviewing a closed file. I had won the only game that mattered to me, the game of absolute independence. I sat in my quiet condominium, drinking premium coffee, reviewing quarterly profit margins that would have made Mark's arrogant accounting team deeply envious. My fortress was impregnable because it was built on operational excellence, not on manipulating vulnerable people. I established protocols for every aspect of Apex logistics. Every driver was heavily vetted. Every route was optimized by software I personally calibrated. I treated my employees with respect, paying them above market rates, which guaranteed absolute loyalty and zero turnover. In the high-stakes world of corporate event staging, reliability was the most expensive commodity, and I controlled the supply. My attorney, Grace, who I had retained early on to structure my corporate entities, often joked that my contracts were tighter than a Federal Reserve vault. I didn't smile at the joke. It wasn't humour, it was a survival mechanism. I ensured that Apex Logistics carried zero unnecessary debt. While my competitors leveraged their trucks to buy bigger warehouses, I kept my overhead brutally lean. I wanted a balance sheet that could withstand an economic hurricane. I had survived a Category 5 storm in my personal life, and I refused to leave any structural vulnerabilities in my professional empire. Sitting in my glass-walled office, watching the fleet of Apex trucks roll out for the morning deliveries, I felt a deep, resonating calm. The fragile, dependent wife Mark had discarded no longer existed in any dimension. The fortress was built. My operations manager, a sharp, highly efficient woman named Claire, walked into my office on a Tuesday morning and dropped a thick production binder onto my glass desk. "We just landed the exclusive transport bid for the Grand Drake Gala next month," she announced, tapping the cover. "It is the largest single-night logistics contract we have secured this year. Premium margins." I opened the binder and reviewed the client specifications. It was a massive equipment haul for a luxury real estate launch. I turned to the second page to check the primary vendor details. There, printed in bold, glossy letters, was the name of the development firm. Below it, a high-resolution promotional photograph of the principal partners. It was Mark and Vanessa. If you've ever found strength you didn't know you had after hitting rock bottom, hit the like button. It helps more than you know. They were standing in front of a digital rendering, both flashing identical, aggressively confident smiles. The headline read, "The visionaries behind the $40 million South Loop revitalization." I stared at Mark's face. I expected a sudden rush of adrenaline, a spike of old panic, or a wave of bitter anger. I waited for the biological reaction. Nothing happened. My heart rate remained perfectly steady at 65 beats per minute. I was looking at a photograph of strangers. They require absolute confidentiality and a zero-tolerance policy for staging delays. Claire noted, misinterpreting my silence. "The delivery window is brutally tight. Do we accept the terms?" I looked at the logistical requirements. It was a complex operation, moving delicate digital displays and architectural models into a historic, highly restricted hotel space. It was exactly the kind of high-pressure puzzle my company excelled at solving. Refusing a highly profitable contract because of an old personal ghost would be a terrible business decision. And I was, above all things, a very good businesswoman. "The margins are excellent," I said quietly, picking up my favourite fountain pen. "We accept the terms. Ensure the non-disclosure agreements are locked. They don't need to know who owns Apex Logistics. They just need the equipment delivered flawlessly." I signed the primary authorization and handed the binder back to Claire. She nodded and left the office to initiate the deployment sequence. I looked back down at the stray promotional flyer that had slipped from the binder. Vanessa looked older, polished to a severe edge. Mark looked exactly the same. A man convinced he was the smartest person in any room. I slid the flyer into the shredder beneath my desk. I didn't spend the rest of the afternoon obsessing over their success. I didn't scour the internet to read articles about their $40 million venture. That kind of neurotic tracking belonged to a victim, and I had resigned from that role permanently. I simply opened my logistics software and began mapping the optimal delivery routes to the Grand Drake Hotel. I calculated the fuel costs, the union labour hours, and the specific clearance heights of the hotel's underground service bays. Mark was busy selling a glittering architectural fantasy to wealthy investors. I was busy calculating the exact turning radius required to back a 50-foot commercial trailer into a 19th century loading dock without scratching the masonry. Our worlds were about to physically intersect. But we were operating in entirely different realities. He was still playing a game of perception. I was executing a masterclass in precision. I approved the final routing schedule and closed my laptop for the day. The ghosts had returned. That weekend, I decided to finally clear out the small storage unit I had maintained since leaving the studio apartment. I was systematically transferring old documents into digital archives, deep in the back corner, resting beneath a stack of heavy winter blankets, was the floral patterned tin tea box. I pulled it out into the harsh fluorescent light of the storage corridor. It had been nearly 3 years since Estelle handed it to me. I had kept my promise. I hadn't opened it when I was desperate. I was opening it now because I was ready. I sat on a plastic crate and broke the rusted seal on the lid. The box smelled faintly of dried lavender and old paper. Inside, there was no cash, no sentimental jewellery, and no emotional letters. There was a thick stack of heavy, yellowed legal parchment bound by a thick rubber band. Resting on top of the documents was a folded, hand-drawn surveyor's map and a small, crisp index card. I picked up the index card first. Estelle's handwriting was elegant and perfectly steady. It read, "Do not let anyone force you to sign when you are desperate. Read the ink. Control the ground." I set the card aside and unfolded the surveyor's map. It detailed a specific grid of commercial properties in the South Loop district. One tiny, narrow rectangular strip of land, wedged tightly between 2 massive commercial lots, was highlighted in bright red ink. I picked up the heavy stack of legal parchment. The header document was unmistakably clear, stamped with the official seal of the Cook County Clerk. It was an irrevocable trust agreement. I began to read the clauses, my eyes scanning the dense legal terminology with the practiced efficiency of a corporate CEO. I understood every single word. Estelle had not left me a traditional inheritance. Years ago, sensing the aggressive gentrification of the neighbourhood, she had quietly purchased that tiny, seemingly useless alleyway from a bankrupt municipal auction. She had immediately placed it into an ironclad trust. The trust explicitly named me as the sole absolute beneficiary and the only authorised signatory for any future development, sale, or easement access. I looked back at the surveyor's map. Then I pulled up the digital promotional brochure for Mark's $40 million project on my phone. I overlaid the images in my mind. The massive, sprawling footprint of Mark's luxury complex completely surrounded the red highlighted area on Estelle's map, but it didn't absorb it. That tiny, useless alleyway was the exact location of the proposed delivery bay and emergency access route for Mark's entire development. My breathing stopped. I sat perfectly still in the fluorescent hum of the storage unit. The sheer magnitude of Estelle's quiet brilliance hit me like a physical shockwave. She hadn't just protected a piece of dirt, she had correctly anticipated the precise vector of future commercial expansion. Mark's development firm must have assumed the alley was an abandoned municipal utility corridor, easily claimed through eminent domain or quiet title once the surrounding towers were built. They hadn't checked the trust registries deeply enough. They hadn't followed the obscure paper trail leading to a retired librarian's locked-in box. Mark was actively pre-selling luxury condominiums and securing 9-figure construction loans based on architectural blueprints that required access across land he did not own. Land that was legally, absolutely, and irrevocably controlled by the woman he had thrown into the snow. I didn't laugh. I didn't cheer. I carefully folded the map, placed it back into the tin box with the trust documents, and locked the lid. I picked up my phone and dialed my corporate attorney's direct line. It was time for a professional consultation. The map changed everything. I did not immediately call Mark to gloat. Gloating is a symptom of insecurity, and I had outgrown my insecurities. Instead, the following morning, I took the dented tin box to the downtown offices of Sterling and Hayes. Grace was my lead corporate attorney. She was a woman who spoke exclusively in facts and billed by the minute. She had structured the initial corporate veil for Apex Logistics and possessed a mind like a steel trap. I sat across the polished mahogany desk in her corner office and simply handed her the yellowed trust documents and the hand-drawn surveyor's map. Grace adjusted her glasses and began to read. For the first 5 minutes, her expression was a mask of professional neutrality. She was accustomed to reviewing dense operational contracts and multi-million-dollar logistics agreements. But as she reached the specific boundary clauses and the designation of the beneficiary, her reading speed slowed dramatically. She flipped back to the first page, verifying a date, and then cross-referenced the coordinates on Estelle's map with a digital property database on her secondary monitor. The only sound in the room was the soft, rhythmic clicking of her mouse. Slowly, Grace took off her glasses and placed them gently on the desk. She looked at me, completely abandoning her usual stoic demeanour. Her eyes were wide with genuine, unadulterated professional shock. "Sarah," she said, her voice unusually hushed, leaning forward across the desk. "Do you have any idea what your aunt actually did here?" I kept my posture relaxed, folding my hands in my lap. "I have an operational theory," I replied calmly, "but I pay you to confirm the exact legal mechanics." Grace let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh of disbelief. She tapped the yellowed paper with her index finger. "Your aunt didn't just leave you a piece of real estate. She left you the operational kill switch to a $40 million commercial empire." I asked Grace to explain the exact parameters. I needed absolute certainty. Devoid of any emotional interpretation, Grace swiveled her monitor so I could see the digital rendering of the city block. Mark's holding company has successfully consolidated 98% of the required acreage for his South Loop project, she explained, tracing a massive digital footprint. But the city's commercial zoning laws for high-density, mixed-use developments are incredibly rigid regarding emergency vehicle access and commercial freight loading. Without a verified, legally binding easement through this specific, narrow corridor, your corridor, the city planners, cannot legally issue the final occupancy permits. I looked at the tiny red rectangle on the screen. "And Mark doesn't own it," I stated simply. "No," Grace confirmed. "He assumed it was a neglected municipal utility alley, a common oversight in aggressive land grabs. He likely planned to file a quiet title action or claim adverse possession once the concrete was poured, but he can't, because this land isn't abandoned, it is actively shielded." I felt a profound sense of respect for the quiet librarian who had foreseen this exact vulnerability. Estelle hadn't just protected me, she had armed me. The trap was real. "I need to understand the structural integrity of the trust," I said, leaning closer to the documents. "Mark is heavily capitalized. If he discovers this bottleneck, he will hire the most aggressive litigators in the state to break the deed or force a mandatory sale. Can he pierce the veil?" Grace shook her head, a sharp, confident movement. "He can't. And that is the absolute beauty of what your aunt structured." She pulled the primary trust agreement toward her. "This is an irrevocable trust, executed and notarized 4 years before you even married Mark. By legal definition, the assets placed inside an irrevocable trust are permanently removed from the grantor's taxable estate. But more importantly, for your situation, the assets do not belong to you personally. You are the designated operational trustee and the sole beneficiary, but the land is owned by the trust itself. I processed the information, applying the same logic I used for supply chain risk assessment, meaning it is completely insulated from personal liabilities. Exactly, Grace smiled. A predatory, brilliant smile. When Mark forced you to sign that quitclaim deed in the hospital, he legally stripped you of your personal marital assets. He took your shared savings and the house. But he couldn't touch this land because, legally, you didn't own it. The trust owned it. Furthermore, the trust documents explicitly mandate that the property cannot be sold, leased, or granted easement without your direct, uncoerced signature. She tapped the paper again. He can threaten you. He can try to sue you. He can offer you $1 million. But the Municipal Zoning Board operates on verified paper, not intimidation, until you sign a commercial easement agreement. His $40 million glass towers are just very expensive, completely useless sculptures. There was no magic involved. There was no Hollywood hacking or dramatic courtroom shouting match. It was simply the flawless, cold application of established property law. Mark had spent his entire career treating contracts as weapons to dominate the weak. He had never anticipated that an elderly woman in a wheelchair would use the exact same legal framework to build an impenetrable titanium wall. I looked at the signature on the bottom of the page. It was shaky, written by a woman struggling for breath, but it was legally absolute. The ultimate form of justice wasn't revenge. It was an airtight contract. What is our current exposure? I asked. Shifting back into operational mode, Grace opened a separate digital file. I ran a deep sweep on the holding company managing Mark's project. They are currently bleeding capital. They have secured high-interest mezzanine financing to cover construction delays. Every day that project sits empty without occupancy permits, the interest compounds aggressively. They are highly motivated, bordering on desperate, to clear any remaining bureaucratic hurdles. She handed me a printed email thread. In fact, a blind acquisition firm, undoubtedly a shell company acting on Mark's behalf, has been sending automated purchase inquiries to the registered box of the trust for the last 3 weeks. They are offering triple the market value for the alleyway, completely unaware of who actually controls the trust. I read the desperate, increasingly urgent emails from Mark's shell company. He was trapped in a financial bleeding cycle, trying to buy his way out blindly. I didn't feel a shred of pity. The math was perfect. We do not ignore the emails, I told Grace, placing the printouts back on her desk. Ignoring them alerts him that the owner is strategically holding out. We need him to believe he is negotiating with a standard, albeit stubborn, commercial entity. I want you to respond to the blind acquisition firm. Grace picked up her pen, ready to draft the parameters. What is our counter offer 10 times market value? A percentage of the gross project revenue? Neither, I replied, my voice completely flat. A financial counter offer tells him this is a negotiation about money. This is not about money. Respond to their legal team and state that the operational trustee is willing to discuss an easement agreement, but only in person. Tell them the trustee requires a face-to-face meeting with the principal partners of the development firm to ensure the architectural integrity of the neighbourhood is maintained. Grace's eyes narrowed as she calculated the strategic geometry of the move. You want to force Mark into a room? I want him to prepare a presentation, I corrected her. I want him to walk into a room believing he is about to secure the final piece of his empire from a naive landowner. Confirm the meeting for this Friday at his corporate headquarters. What would you do if the person who ruined your life suddenly needed you to save theirs? Tell me in the comments below. I spent the next 4 days operating Apex Logistics with my usual precision. I didn't lose sleep. I didn't practice a dramatic speech in the mirror. Drama implies an emotional investment that I simply no longer possessed. I was treating this meeting exactly like a high-level vendor audit. Mark had stolen my home and left my aunt in the freezing cold. Now. He was bleeding capital, entirely dependent on my signature to prevent a total financial collapse. The scales of leverage had not just tipped, they had completely inverted. On Thursday evening, I selected a tailored, charcoal grey suit from my closet. It was impeccably cut, severe, and purely professional. I laid it out meticulously. Grace handled the correspondence with absolute clinical perfection. Mark's team, eager to finalise the zoning requirements, eagerly accepted the terms of the meeting. They booked their largest executive conference room. They assumed they were dealing with a small-time property manager who wanted to feel important before signing away a useless strip of asphalt. They had no idea they had just invited the architect of their destruction into their inner sanctum. I reviewed the final logistical manifest for the week, ensuring my company would run seamlessly in my absence. Walter texted me a brief message that night. Stay cold? I replied with a simple check mark. I didn't need the reminder, but I appreciated the sentiment. The terrified girl who had packed her life into 5 cardboard boxes was buried forever. The woman who stood in her place understood that true power never raises its voice. True power simply brings the correct paperwork to the table. I set my alarm for 6 in the morning and slept a full, uninterrupted 8 hours. The meeting was confirmed. Friday morning in Chicago was bright, cold, and aggressively clear. Mark's development firm occupied the top 2 floors of a sleek modern high-rise in the financial district. It was an office designed to project absolute unyielding wealth. The reception area featured imported Italian marble, minimalist water features, and a panoramic view of the city skyline. I arrived exactly 3 minutes before the scheduled meeting, accompanied by Grace. I did not look around with wide-eyed wonder. I analysed the space like an auditor evaluating overhead costs. A young, highly polished receptionist greeted us with a practiced, professional smile. Good morning. You must be the representatives for the Estelle Trust. Mr., Foster and Miss Sterling are waiting for you in the primary boardroom. Please, follow me. She led us down a long hallway lined with architectural awards and framed magazine articles detailing Mark's rapid rise in the real estate sector. The psychological staging of the office was obvious intimidate the guest with success before the negotiation even begins. 3 years ago, this hallway would have made me feel remarkably small. Today, I just calculated the monthly lease rate per square foot and noted the inefficiency of the layout. Inside the boardroom, Mark and Vanessa were already seated at the head of a massive, custom-built oak conference table. The table was littered with glossy architectural renderings, financial projections, and perfectly bound legal portfolios. They were prepared for a dominant presentation. Mark was wearing a bespoke navy suit, projecting the casual, relaxed confidence of a man who believes he has already won. Vanessa sat beside him, reviewing a document on her tablet, looking perfectly manicured and deeply bored by the administrative necessity of this meeting. They hadn't looked up yet as the heavy glass doors swung open. They were still trapped in their illusion of total control. I stepped onto the thick carpet. I paused for a fraction of a second, allowing the silence in the room to settle. Grace stood slightly behind me and to my right, holding a single, slender leather briefcase containing the trust documents. She was the silent executioner's assistant. Mark finally finished typing a message on his phone and casually tossed it onto the table. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, fluid motion designed to convey authority. He put on his standard, charismatic corporate smile, the same smile he had used to charm investors, bankers, and once, a very exhausted girl working 3 jobs. He extended his right hand toward the doorway, ready to welcome the anonymous trustee who was holding up his $40 million dream. He was expecting an elderly heir, a confused property manager, or perhaps a greedy lawyer he could easily outmaneuver with a heavy cash offer. He was expecting a transaction. He wasn't expecting an absolute reckoning. I stepped fully into the light streaming from the floor-to-ceiling windows, maintaining a completely neutral, professional expression. The clock struck 10. Mark's hand froze mid-air. The charismatic, practiced smile did not simply fade from his face, it violently collapsed. His eyes widened, and the colour drained from his skin with terrifying speed, leaving him looking like a wax mannequin. Vanessa, noticing his sudden statuesque paralysis, finally looked up from her digital tablet. A sharp, audible gasp escaped her lips, and the tablet clattered loudly onto the oak table. "Good morning, Mark," I said. My voice was perfectly modulated, devoid of any anger, sarcasm, or triumph. It was the exact tone I used when reviewing a late freight manifest. "Vanessa, thank you for hosting us on such short notice." I didn't wait for an invitation. I walked to the opposite end of the massive table, pulled out a high-backed leather chair, and sat down. Grace took the seat next to me, placing the slender briefcase onto the polished oak surface with a soft, definitive thud. Mark was still standing. He looked like a man who had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. His brain was desperately trying to process the impossible mathematics of the situation. "Sarah?" he managed to choke out. His voice was a weak, thin rasp, completely stripped of its usual resonant authority. What are you doing here? This is a private commercial negotiation." He was trying to build a defense using the only tool he understood: exclusion. He desperately wanted to believe there had been a scheduling error, a bizarre coincidence. He wanted to believe I was just in the wrong room. "I am entirely aware of the agenda." "Mark," I replied, folding my hands neatly on the table. "You requested a face-to-face meeting with the sole operational trustee of the Estelle Irrevocable Trust. You are currently looking at her. We are here to discuss the mandatory easement access required for your South Loop development project. You may begin your presentation whenever you are ready." Vanessa stared at me, her eyes darting between my tailored suit and Mark's pale face. The realization hit the room like a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a mistake. The woman they had evicted into the freezing snow, the woman they had stripped of every financial asset, was the absolute, undeniable owner of the only piece of land that could save them from total financial ruin. I looked at Mark's trembling hands resting on the edge of the table. He had spent his life building a $40 million lock. I was holding the only key. I did not offer a dramatic monologue about karma or justice. I let the absolute, crushing silence of the boardroom do the heavy lifting. The power dynamic had completely inverted in the span of 30 seconds, and I wanted them to feel the agonizing weight of that shift. Mark slowly sank back into his chair, his posture defeated, his bespoke suit suddenly looking like a costume that was 2 sizes too big. He looked at the stacks of architectural blueprints and financial projections scattered across the table. They were completely useless now. They were just expensive paper waiting to be shredded. He finally understood that the trap hadn't just closed. It had been locked for 3 years. He had underestimated the quiet librarian, and he had fatally underestimated me. He cleared his throat, desperately trying to summon the arrogance that had defined his entire existence. But there was no arrogance left. There was only the cold, hard reality of an ironclad legal contract. I tilted my head slightly, waiting for his first move. The game was over. The panic in Mark's eyes slowly morphed into something much more pathetic. It morphed into raw desperation. He dropped the trust document onto the table and leaned forward, clasping his hands together in a gesture of sudden, manufactured humility. "Sarah," he began, his voice dropping to a soft, pleading register. "Let's be reasonable about this. We were married for 8 years. We built a life together. I know the end of our marriage was difficult, but you can't deliberately destroy the livelihood of hundreds of contractors and investors over a personal grudge." I looked at him, completely immune to the emotional manipulation. He was trying to invoke a shared history that he had personally annihilated. "I am being entirely reasonable," I replied softly. "A reasonable business owner does not grant a critical commercial easement to a heavily leveraged developer who has a documented history of financial bad faith." Vanessa stood up abruptly. Her face was flushed with anger, but the anger wasn't directed at me. "You told me the title clearances were pristine." "Mark," she hissed, her professional veneer completely shattering. "You assured the primary investors that the municipal footprint was secured. You lied to everyone." Mark ignored her, keeping his desperate, laser-like focus on me. "I can authorize a buyout," he offered rapidly, the sweat now visible on his forehead. $2 million, cash transfer by the end of the week. You can expand your logistics company. You can buy a new house. Whatever you want. Sarah, just sign the easement authorization. What would you do if the person who ruined your life suddenly needed you to save theirs? Tell me in the comments below. He reached into his jacket pocket and pushed a premium silver ink pen across the oak table toward me. It was the exact same motion, the exact same kind of pen he had used in the hospital corridor 3 years ago when my aunt was fighting for her life. The poetic symmetry of the moment was stunning. I looked at the silver pen resting on the polished wood. I didn't touch it. I looked back up at Mark's terrified face. "Do you remember the night you brought me the paperwork for the medical loan?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried clearly across the large room. Mark swallowed hard, the remaining colour draining from his face. He remembered. "You told me you were lifting my burden," I continued, maintaining unwavering eye contact. "You used my terror as leverage to steal my home. You left my aunt in the freezing cold." I leaned back in my leather chair, perfectly composed. "I told you at the gala, Mark, I remember every single paper you ever made me sign, and because I remember, I will never sign another document for you as long as I live." I stood up. Grace immediately closed her briefcase. The meeting was over. "You have 2 hours to get your trash off my property," I quoted softly. I turned and walked toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, my heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor. I didn't look back to see Mark bury his face in his hands, nor did I turn to watch Vanessa storm out of the room through the secondary exit. The satisfaction I felt wasn't a burning, chaotic fire. It was a cool, refreshing breeze. I had walked into the fortress of my abuser, unarmed except for the truth, and I had dismantled his entire existence without raising my voice a single decibel. The elevator ride down to the lobby was perfectly silent. I stepped out into the crisp Chicago air, hailed a cab, and went back to running my logistics company. I didn't sign. Mark did not surrender gracefully. Cornered predators rarely do. 2 days after I walked out of his boardroom, a certified process server arrived at the Apex Logistics headquarters. Mark had liquidated a portion of his remaining personal assets to hire a notorious, highly aggressive downtown litigation firm. They filed an emergency injunction and a civil lawsuit against me, formally accusing me of deliberately hiding marital assets during our divorce proceedings. It was a dying kick. It was a desperate, scorched earth attempt to tie up the Estelle Trust in years of brutal legal discovery, hoping I would run out of legal funds or lose my nerve and settle for the easement. Claire, my operations manager, looked deeply concerned when she signed for the intimidating stack of legal summons. I simply carried the envelope into my office, scanned the documents, and emailed them to Grace. I didn't panic. I had anticipated this exact manoeuvre. Mark was playing checkers. We had been playing three-dimensional chess for years. The preliminary hearing was scheduled rapidly due to the emergency injunction status. Mark arrived at the courthouse looking exhausted, his bespoke suit wrinkled, but he tried to project an aura of arrogant confidence. He was flanked by 3 expensive lawyers who planned to overwhelm the judge with volume and intimidation tactics. I sat quietly at the defense table, wearing my charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight. The hearing lasted exactly 45 minutes. Grace did not engage in theatrical arguments with Mark's lawyers. She simply submitted 2 pieces of verified evidence to the judge. The first was the original, date-stamped creation document of the Estelle Trust, proving undeniably that it existed long before I ever met Mark, completely negating the claim of hidden marital assets. The second piece of evidence was the fatal blow. Grace submitted Estelle's sealed hospital records, cross-referenced with the exact timestamp of the quitclaim deed Mark had forced me to sign. She established a clear, mathematically undeniable timeline of extreme emotional duress and fraudulent inducement. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with decades of experience, reviewed the timeline. She looked over her glasses at Mark's legal team with absolute disdain. "Counsel," she said sharply, her voice echoing in the courtroom, "your client used a medical emergency to fraudulently strip the defendant of her assets, and now you are attempting to use my courtroom to steal a pre-existing trust. This injunction is denied with prejudice." She paused, locking eyes with Mark. "Furthermore, I am forwarding the evidence of the quitclaim execution to the State Bar and the District Attorney for a comprehensive review regarding criminal fraud." Mark's lead attorney physically stepped away from him. The counterattack hadn't just failed. It had triggered a catastrophic legal backlash. Mark sat at the plaintiff's table, staring blankly at the wood grain, his mouth slightly open. He had brought a knife to a gunfight, only to realise I owned the ammunition factory. Grace gathered our files with quiet efficiency. As we walked down the centre aisle of the courtroom, Mark didn't try to stop me. He didn't offer another buyout. He finally understood that there was no manipulation left to deploy. The law, the very weapon he had used to destroy my life, had just been turned against him with devastating precision. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom and stepped out into the bright hallway. The dying kick was over, and the beast was finally dead. The gavel fell. The collapse of Mark's empire was neither slow nor graceful. It was a rapid, brutal implosion, driven entirely by the unforgiving mathematics of commercial real estate. Once the preliminary injunction was denied, and the news of the easement blockade became public record within the financial sector, the dominoes began to fall with terrifying speed. The primary investors for the South Loop project immediately pulled their funding commitments. They cited gross breach of fiduciary duty and a fundamental failure to secure basic operational permits. Without the influx of investor capital, Mark's holding company rapidly defaulted on the high-interest mezzanine loans he had secured to start construction. The bank moved swiftly to cut its losses, initiating aggressive foreclosure proceedings on the 98% of the land Mark did own. The $40 million dream evaporated overnight into a mountain of crippling corporate debt. But the professional destruction was only half of the karma. Vanessa, realizing her own design firm's reputation was tethered to a sinking ship and a potential criminal fraud investigation, severed all ties immediately. She issued a cold, highly sanitized public statement claiming she was entirely misled by Mark's financial disclosures. She moved out of the house they shared, my old house, within a week, leaving him completely isolated in a massive empty property he could no longer afford. I watched the fallout from the quiet comfort of my high-rise condominium, reading the financial briefs Grace periodically forwarded to me. I didn't celebrate. I didn't pop champagne or post cryptic messages on social media. The destruction of his life wasn't my ultimate goal. It was simply the mathematical consequence of his own actions catching up to him. He had built a life on stealing foundations, and when he finally encountered a foundation, he couldn't steal. The entire structure collapsed. A month later, Grace called me with a final piece of news. The bank was auctioning off Mark's foreclosed assets, including the residential property he had stolen from me. He was officially bankrupt, facing disbarment, and actively under investigation for fraud. He was reportedly moving into a cheap, month-to-month rental unit on the far outskirts of the city. He had lost the house, the money, the woman, and his reputation. I thanked Grace for the update and hung up the phone. I looked out over the glittering Chicago skyline. The city looked cleaner somehow. There is a specific kind of quiet that follows a storm of that magnitude. It isn't just the absence of noise, it is the presence of absolute resolution. Mark had spent his life convinced that he was the apex predator in a city of sheep. He never realised that true strength doesn't roar. True strength is the patience to build a flawless system and the discipline to let the system execute its function. He was back exactly where he had forced me to start, at the absolute bottom. But unlike me, he didn't have a mentor like Walter, he didn't have a fierce aunt's love to guide him, and he certainly didn't have the resilience to rebuild. He only had his ego, and his ego was bankrupt. I closed the financial brief and opened my logistics dashboard. The empire collapsed. I instructed Grace to attend the bank's liquidation auction on my behalf. I didn't want Mark's commercial lots or his ruined corporate assets. I only wanted one specific piece of the wreckage. Through a proxy LLC, I purchased my old house back from the bank for absolute pennies on the dollar. It was purely a cash transaction, funded entirely by the legitimate hard-earned profits of Apex Logistics. When the title finally cleared, I drove to the property alone. It was late afternoon, the autumn sunlight casting long, golden shadows across the overgrown lawn. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was entirely empty, stripped of Vanessa's expensive, pretentious decor and Mark's arrogant presence. The air was stale, but the oppressive weight that used to hang in the hallways was completely gone. I walked slowly through the foyer and into the first-floor bedroom that used to belong to Aunt Estelle. Vanessa had discarded most of the old furniture, assuming it was worthless. But in the corner of the room, gathering a thick layer of dust, sat the dark green velvet reading chair. She had left it behind, likely deeming it too heavy or too outdated to move to her new apartment. I walked over and ran my hand along the worn, familiar fabric. I sat down in the chair and looked out the window at the quiet suburban street. The silence in the house wasn't lonely. It felt entirely cleansed. I didn't buy the house to live in it. It was too big for one person, and my life was downtown now, managing a thriving logistics empire. I bought it to reclaim the narrative. I had already contacted a trusted commercial contractor. The property was going to be completely renovated and converted into the Estelle House, a fully funded, subsidised, transitional living space for elderly women facing housing insecurity. The tiny strip of commercial land in the South Loop, the one that broke Mark's empire, was being permanently leased to the city for a modest fee to build a community park. That lease generated a perpetual trust income that would fund the Estelle House's operations indefinitely. I sat in the green velvet chair, breathing in the quiet peace of the afternoon. I thought about the terrified woman who had been dragged out of this house into the freezing snow. She felt like a distant memory, a character from a book I had read a long time ago. I had lost everything in this house, but I had found my true self in the ruins. I rested my head against the back of the chair and closed my eyes. I realised that the greatest revenge wasn't just surviving, it was creating a system that ensured no one else would have to endure the same kind of suffering. Mark had used his power to isolate and destroy. I was using my power to shelter and protect. The cycle of abuse had been broken, replaced by a cycle of resilience. I opened my eyes and watched a single autumn leaf drift past the window pane. The house was going to be filled with voices again soon. Voices of women who deserved safety, respect, and a warm place to read. I stood up, patted the armrest of the green velvet chair, and walked out the front door, locking it securely behind me. I was finally home. I spent the following spring watching the architectural transformation of my two most important properties. Apex Logistics continued to scale rapidly, securing lucrative international freight contracts. But my true operational focus was on the legacy I was actively building back in my old suburban neighbourhood. I hired a specialised, highly ethical architectural firm to completely remodel the old house. We deliberately tore down the pretentious, restrictive walls Vanessa had erected during her brief, arrogant residency. We opened up the floor plan to create bright, accessible communal spaces. We installed medical-grade ramps, widened every doorway for strict wheelchair access, and built a beautiful indoor conservatory filled with natural light and thriving green plants. Walter, who had quietly supported me during my darkest 6 months above the train tracks, became my primary operational advisor for the renovation project. He had officially retired from his own dispatch business, but he possessed an unparalleled eye for structural integrity and project management. He would walk the construction site with me every Tuesday morning, wearing his old scuffed work boots and carrying a battered thermos of strong black coffee. He didn't offer empty, patronising praise. He offered highly practical solutions. He showed the contractors how to reinforce the foundational joists to support the heavy medical equipment we plan to install for the future residents. He was the mentor I desperately needed, providing the steady, reliable guidance that had been completely absent during my marriage. On crisp morning, as Walter and I were reviewing the final electrical blueprints on the front porch, my cell phone vibrated. It was an unrecognised local number. I answered it, expecting a routine vendor update regarding the new HVAC system. It was Mark. His voice sounded thin, raspy, and completely stripped of its former resonant corporate polish. He was calling from a cheap prepaid phone. I had read in the industry briefs that he had managed to avoid federal criminal charges by heavily cooperating with the financial regulators, but he was permanently, legally barred from operating in the commercial real estate sector. He was reportedly working as a junior sales associate at a regional hardware supply chain. He called to ask for a small, unsecured personal loan. He claimed, his voice trembling slightly, that he was struggling to make the monthly rent on his tiny studio apartment on the edge of the city limits. I listened to his pathetic request in complete, unbroken silence. 3 years ago, I had desperately begged him for a medical loan in a sterile hospital corridor, and he had used that exact moment of vulnerability to steal my home and evict my sick aunt. Now, he was begging me for basic survival money while standing in the smouldering ruins of his own arrogance. I didn't feel a sudden surge of vindictive joy. I didn't feel the urge to scream at him or list his countless betrayals. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of clinical detachment at his sheer, unadulterated audacity. He still believed he could manipulate his way out of consequence. "Mark," I said evenly, watching a construction crew carefully install the new, reinforced front doors of the Estelle house. "You have exactly 2 seconds to permanently delete this number from your phone." I ended the call before he could utter another syllable and systematically blocked the contact. I didn't mention the call to Walter. I simply turned my attention back to the complex electrical blueprint spread across the makeshift table. We had a strict operational timeline to meet, and I absolutely refused to waste another valuable minute of my life looking backward into the dark. The foundation of my new existence was entirely secure, and the walls were rising beautifully. The foundation was solid. The grand opening of the Estelle House took place on a remarkably clear, bright morning in early October. There were no expensive champagne towers, no glossy promotional brochures, and absolutely no wealthy investors seeking a tax write-off. The guest list was deliberately small and deeply personal. It consisted of Walter, my dedicated logistics management team from Apex, Grace from the legal firm, and the first 5 elderly women who were moving into their new, fully subsidised sanctuary. I stood in the centre of the spacious, sunlit living room, holding a simple ceramic mug of hot tea. I watched as one of our new residents, a retired schoolteacher who had lost her pension to a predatory relative, settled comfortably into the dark green velvet reading chair by the bay window. She ran her hand along the worn fabric, a look of profound, quiet relief washing over her face. She was finally safe. They were all completely safe. I walked into the small administrative office I had built near the front entrance. It was a purely functional space, equipped with a clean desk, a secure filing cabinet, and a large window that offered a clear view of the peaceful suburban street. I sat down in my chair and opened my laptop to check the morning freight schedules for Apex Logistics. The numbers were flawless. The supply chain was running with absolute mechanical perfection. My professional empire was secure, and my personal sanctuary was finally complete. I thought back to the freezing, brutal winter day when Mark had stood in my empty living room and coldly ordered me to get my trash off his property. At the time, I truly believed my entire world had ended. I believed I was entirely powerless, just another victim in a corporate game I didn't understand. But surviving the freezing cold does something remarkable to a person. It forces you to discover exactly what kind of steel exists inside your spine. It teaches you that anger is a remarkably inefficient fuel, but cold, methodical calculation can move mountains. Mark spent his entire life destroying people to build a fragile illusion of power. I spent 3 years learning his language so I could permanently dismantle that illusion with a single, perfectly executed legal signature. I didn't need to break his bones or ruin his reputation with vicious rumours. I simply introduced him to the unforgiving reality of his own paperwork. I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. The trauma he inflicted on me was no longer an open, bleeding wound. It had scarred over, becoming a tough, permanent reminder of my own capacity to rebuild from absolute zero. I had learned the most valuable lesson of my life in the darkest moments of my despair. Legacy isn't what you blindly inherit from the people who casually broke you. It is the impenetrable fortress you build to ensure that absolutely no one else is ever broken in the exact same way. If Sarah's journey to reclaiming her power inspired you, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories of justice, and until next time, keep building your empire. The door clicked shut,